Hi, you know how we glorify violence and the victims of it in a way that pushes our agenda and generalizes our worldview in an overly simplistic black and white good and evil way? To the point whatever tragedy happened is mystified and cemented into the next page of what is essentially the gospel of our ideologies? Yeah, it all started with this. The first great work of Western literature, the Iliad, is also arguably the first Western case of glorification of violence. It celebrates the heroic warrior ideal. Achilles and Hector find meaning and immortality through killing their enemies. That is brutal, that is noble, that is idealistic, and that is badass. And for a long time, that was the norm. Rome and the gladiators, and then Christians and the Crusaders. In the Middle Ages, glorification of violence became religious, as Crusaders joyfully genocided non-Christians in the Baltics, while poets celebrated death with verses. For centuries, violence was then glorified through acts of devotion and the veneration of religious martyrs. Think Joan of Arc. She embodies holy violence reimagined as personal conviction. But once these paintings of a woman piercing her heart with a dagger started showing up out of nowhere, that's when we started to shift into the kind of glorification of violence we have today. Well, one of them, a huge part of glorification today happens due to oversaturation in the age of information. Chances are you probably start the day with a true crime podcast on the way to work and then watch a video essay about, the war in Iraq on lunch break or something, only to finish the day with a movie based on a true crime story, all the while trying to ignore the news of yet another school shooting. It's something unprecedented, and that's not the kind of venerated violence that these paintings started. I'm talking about the kind of glorification that will either lead you to celebrate the death of this guy or to treat him like a cultural martyr. The Lucretia paintings are a very, very early antecessor to modern political and ideological glorification of violence, particularly through art. Lucretia was the wife of a Roman nobleman named Lucius Tarquinius. She was raped by Sextus Tarquinius, it's just funny that his name is Sex, son of the tyrant king of Rome, who threatened to kill her and her slaves if she resisted. The next morning, Lucretia called her father and husband, told them what happened. She demanded vengeance and then plunged a dagger into her own heart. Her husband swore an oath of revenge on the same dagger, parading her body through the Roman Forum, which led to the revolt that overthrew the monarchy and gave birth to the Roman Republic that we know and maybe love. Over 2,000 years later, and Lucretia paintings started turning up. Each one of them is a celebration of classical republicanism and democracy in a way that preceded the political art of modernity. Lucretia paintings started out with a lot of diversity, actually. Guido Reni's Lucretia translates the story through the glances of the Catholic moralism that was predominant during the Counter-Reformation. And Rembrandt's Lucretia is more about the psychology of morality, really, rather than the glorification of the violence. He turns the trope inward by sort of questioning what honor and shame even is. And Artemisia's Lucretia is not a venerator of Republican ideals at all. It reads more like a feminine, traumatized interrogation of sexual violence, really. She doesn't seem to celebrate the victim. She weaponizes the story to expose victimizing structures. Now, the Venice painter Tintoretto brings a very dramatic addition to the genre. Venice itself had a republican self-image. They favored the classical model that reinforced social order and civic duty. as opposed to the general aristocratic ideas of the Middle Ages. So the story of Lucretia falls perfectly into this idea because it paints a very clear distinction between aristocratic tyranny and an idealized republican sense of self-determination and freedom. Something you can kind of see in Botticelli's The Story of Lucretia, one of his least known works, really. It is a humanist revival of the classical narrative. But the Republican virtue illustrated here feels very oversimplistic. It showcases each aspect of her story. And yet, it reads like a code translation of each chapter of the story. It is humanist, yeah, but it doesn't go further than that. It feels like the Renaissance is winking at American Revolution artwork. Much like this painting, much of the glorification of violence that we have today is more like a reiteration of an event that happened and not much else. Like a 9/11 movie, it says this thing happened, and then it hopes the emotional tool of that information is just enough to elicit a response from us and for us to come to some sort of moral reflection on our own. But the abuse of power depicted in the story could be read as something literal. Lucretia is power. She was part of the Roman elite, but not necessarily a socialite, the way that we think of it today. But the more people painted her, the more they laced her with pomp and circumstance, like my favorite Paolo Veronese. Here, she is a full-blown socialite. It's hard to find any Republican ideals over here amongst all the gold. Veronese aestheticizes the event, turning it into a moment of ceremonial aristocracy. The beauty of the sacrifice of it are linked to elite notions of honor. Something we can also see with Sir Godfrey's Lucretia, made right before the Enlightenment. It represents a mannered moral tableau, which is useful to elite patrons. And since we're talking about elites, Titian is like the Michael Jordan of painters. Bro was notorious for brand deals, meaning he produced royal commissions with the same veracity of a furry porn artist. Look at the Doge Grimani painting. This shit goes hard, but it was literally commissioned for what amounts to be political propaganda, as Doge was a political title in Italy, and Grimani wanted to show people how pious he was. Lucretia and Tarquin by Titian shows how royal patrons used classical subjects for political messaging. The tragic private moment is turned into a public moral lesson that, like a lot of Titian's paintings, was useful to courts who admired the Roman model. The truth is, none of these painters or their work was ideological, because ideology as we know it didn't exactly exist back then, but their belief in humanism, their belief in the virtue of classical republicanism, their disdain for tyranny, as well as their veneration of virtue and self-determination as a symbol of intellectual elitism, it screams the Enlightenment, despite all of those works being created before the movement, which was the first modern movement that was explicitly ideological. All of that leads us to this. Giuseppe Cades walked so that social media activists could run. The Rape of Lucretia is perhaps the most brutal piece of all Lucretia pieces. It was created in 1795, during the Enlightenment, at the time when Lucretia's story firmly became ideological in the sense that we know today. A symbol of liberty, virtue, and the people's right to overthrow tyranny. And with this, the glorification of violence as we know it was born. Lucretia paintings started with psychological introspection, the expression of moralized virtue and Catholic purity, and the analysis of the nuances of victimization, but it ended with the same civic humanism of Botticelli, but expressed through the enlightened revival of the Roman models of civic virtue and liberty, and it's all thrown in your face with the same raw realism that someone would post a photo of George Floyd dying. Today, the glorification of violence goes both ways in the political spectrum, and it is often shared around like, here's a picture of October 7th. I right and therefore I good, you're wrong and therefore you're the devil. Nuance is completely off the table when it comes to violence glorified. In a way, kind of like how this Giuseppe Cade's work removes the historical context of Lucretia paintings with the goal of telling a more clear-cut story with a defined ideological message behind it. Something that you see all over TikTok today. At least Paolo Veronese made it very clear she was a member of the elite, while Cadiz over here says Lucretia represents liberty despite the fact she had slaves herself. The people who saw her die didn't overthrow the monarchy to redistribute wealth and abolish slavery. They did it because they were personally affected by tyranny. Even the humanists like Botticelli didn't really focus on how horrible it was that this happened to a woman. They didn't really give a shit. The whole focus is on what the whole ordeal supposedly represents, making Lucretia paintings the spiritual antecessor to a Twitter thread. Looks pretty
Thank you
as
so
fuck
much
though.
for watching. If you watched it to the end, and if you've been watching my other videos as well, I really fucking appreciate that. Make sure to subscribe and stick around because I will be posting every day, and I will be posting one animation per week. So I will see you tomorrow.